Yes. So we're going to talk about um, some stuff. So first up, the journey so far, the things we've been talking about the last few weeks or so. Um, so what have we been talking about the last few weeks? Well, essentially, what we've been doing is looking at. So we're looking at the game, and we're looking at the I guess the main protagonists involved in developing and playing the game as well. So, we've got our designer who designs the game. Um, we've got the development team who actually builds the game, and sometimes there's a bit of crossover and what have you. But let's sort of assume that those roles are separated completely. And then we have the player that plays the game. We've been looking so far at each of these roles in a way. So the important thing is really how each of those sees the game itself. So the designer, designs a player experience. So we're talking about the design of player experiences, and then translates that design into a form that can be used by the development team to play the game. So the designer actually sees the game as both a player experience as well as a collection of game actors or things that make up the game. We talked about those last week and calling them game actors. So that's the designer. So the designer has to sort of straddle two kind of ways of seeing the game, both seeing it as from the player's perspective, as a player experience, and from the development team's experience, for the development team's perspective, talking about game actors and the actual structure of the game, or what the development team needs to build. So the development team actually is the group of people who build the game, who primarily will see the game as a collection of game actors that need to be created. So there's a bit of tension there, and at the moment, there's it's not necessarily the difference between those two isn't necessarily strongly understood. I think in the industry and even in the sort of academic research side of things. And then, of course, we have the player. Player has a player experience and sees the game as a collection of player experiences. So, and that's just basically how if you're playing a game, how you might describe it to, a friend, or if you're writing it up online, it's all about what you experience as a player of the game. You could argue that if, as a player, you start actually seeing the game as a collection of game actors, then perhaps the game development team has kind of dropped the ball and hasn't really done their job in that respect. So, yeah, agree with that. Any thoughts on that so far? It's kind of what we've been kind of looking at, the interplay between these three different protagonists when it comes to games.
Yeah, no, it reminds me a lot of sort of the adjacent study I've been doing into things like wayfinding and architecture.
Mm-hmm.
You can split ththose up just as easily as the architect
Sure,
versus the builders and all their various roles, and then
absolutely.
the person who uses it at the end. And I think there's a really good sort of analogy there, which
Mm-hmm.
helps me at least sort of remain focused on what each aspect is.
So in
So,
that case, instead of a game, we'd be talking about some type of building. Could be a
mhm.
house, could be a public building. The architect is the designer. So here we're talking about obviously game designer. I mean, architects design buildings. Game designers design games. Development team, is in architecture is going to be your engineers, your builders, your
Or the tradies.
interior designers, all the trades, all the trades, etc. And you need to communicate to them what needs to be built. So they don't necessarily have the big picture. I mean, if you're a plumber, do you really give a crap about the big picture of your building, or do you give a crap about uh, where the pipes need to go? That's pretty much what you need to do, isn't it? Why do you care about the big picture of the building? Yeah.
Yeah, and it saves that the designer can't get too focused on the super minute details, right? Like I keep
Yeah.
thinking about, I'm imagining it in the sense of like a doorway
Mm-hmm.
where the player should pass through the door. It should be where they expect it to. It should open how they expect it to.
Mm-hmm.
The designer slash architecture, their whole job is making sure that the door is placed in a way that is natural for the player, but also fits the fire codes and creates a good pathway for light and those sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
And then, the framer, the carpenter that's putting it in, they're focused on, does the door meet the specific requirements? Are these wood panels installed correctly? Are my hinges on the right side? And so it's all about like trying to develop this network in harmony so that everyone's jobs are easier
Mm-hmm.
and they each focus on their specific aspect.
And we're talking about, particularly if you're talking about large buildings, skyscrapers or something, you're talking about thousands of different components, different bits and pieces that sometimes need to be built from scratch. So you might need to build your door from scratch, all the different parts of it, and it all needs to fit together nicely and work when it comes to the user or whoever's using the building. It needs to actually, and it doesn't need to just, when it comes to architecture, it doesn't need to just be functional. It needs to have. There's an architect. Was it, I think, Christopher Alexander, who came up with this concept of design patterns, and the design patterns are, in his words, how to create spaces that have life or have that X factor. Because you may have experienced some different buildings that just have a bad feeling of it. They just don't work very well, even though functionally they work. Acme is probably a good. Remember, we went to Acme when you came here, Fraser.
Yeah.
That has been notorious since it was built in the 90s. Like, it just never worked. People hated it. People stayed away in droves. And they've had to continuously change it again and again and again. And now it kind of works. But initially, that piece of architecture people hated it. And it just did not work on a human level at all. Even though functionally it was fine.
I loved that that example you gave with the player experience, where if they're not seeing it as just player experiences and they're starting to see the actors, then maybe something's gone wrong. It reminds me of that classic sort of design with push and pull doors. Where if you put a handle on a door, the user's going to expect to pull it. And it feels the same way in games, right? Like if you do something, you pull the player out, and then all of a sudden they're critiquing the game. They're no longer focusing on the experience.
Yes. And we should, with that, because I think that's an example from a great design book, The Design of Everyday Things. So if anyone hasn't read that, definitely recommend it. Very influential, highly influential book.
I think I first heard about that through 99PI, which is fantastic design podcasting.
Oh, okay.
The podcast, I guess like NPR, really good. I mean, if you haven't heard of them, check them out. It's all about design thinking, and they cover so many different broad topics. A lot of urban design, but it's really interesting and really well done.
What was the name again?
99PI. 99% invisible.
Oh, okay. Cool. Yeah, I'll check it out. Okay. So, I just wanted to frame that. I think it's kind of important to sort of see what we're really doing. So we've spent, a number of weeks going through all this, and essentially what we're trying to do is we're trying to support the designer in their job and the way they see the game. So, needing to see it both through player experience and a collection of game actors, which then, if the designer does their job properly, then they're supporting the development team in being able to see the game simply as a collection of game actors. If you're a game actor focusing on AI, if you're a programmer focusing on AI, you don't need to know about all of the game world. You don't need to know the big picture of the game. You need to focus on the AI and exactly sort of what's going on. So you need the designer needs to present the development team with a view of the game that is suitable for them, so that they can actually create it. And then, of course, we've got the player, and as we were saying before, the player should see the game as a collection of player experiences. And ideally, you shouldn't be thinking about anything other than that experience. If you start thinking about that AI is terrible, then something's probably going a bit wrong. So that's what we've been doing over the last few weeks. Now today, I think this might be our last kind of theoretical week. We're actually going to talk about player experiences. So we all know player experiences, as we were just saying. So the player plays the game, and the player has a player experience. So what is a player experience? Oh, I mean, it's kind of everything that internally that happens with a player. It's what's going on. It's the way they feel. We've talked about the different aspects previously. Now, but we do have these things in the sort of model we put together, which I'm calling a player experience. So a player experience is, I guess, a little like an esoteric, what happens within the player's mind. The game actors are the components of the game. So there's two major parts in this. Player experiences occur in the game world, not surprisingly. They couldn't really occur anywhere else. But it's when the player goes out into the game, in the game world, which is pretty much everything in the game, they have some kind of experience. So let's just talk about sort of player experiences. They're also hierarchical in the same way that game actors can be hierarchical as well. So you can have like a big picture, if you like, player experience, and we'll look at some examples in a moment. And then within that, you may have smaller player experiences as well. So going down to that level. Here's an example from Rust, an analysis I did of Rust, where I went through and did a wipe day, and then also within that, player experience, you can also say there's other player experiences which are valid in their own right, such as doing things like resource gathering, crafting, base building, and combat. Now you notice we're not talking about any of the components there. We're not talking about how you build these things. This is simply what the player's experience is when they're doing things like all of this. And that's pretty common in a lot of different games. A lot of different games will have things like resource gathering. A lot of different games will have crafting, base building, and combat. So these are pretty common. Now, this next one is pretty important. So, describing player experiences. So far, we've talked about the different relationships, the personal relationships between the player and the components, so the game actors. But the way we describe a player experience is using something called a player story. So this is kind of where we start getting, and in fact, in a way, we're ending at the beginning, possibly, because player stories, I think, could be a logical place to actually begin your design journey. So, but that's fine. I think we had to do this in reverse. But player stories. So, what are player stories exactly? So, player stories describe a player experience. So, obviously, we'll go back here. This is exactly what we're talking about. So, a player story, it describes this player experience. So they tell the story of the subjective experience of a player going through some sort of player experience. They are not part of the story, script, or narrative of the game. So keep that in mind. Don't confuse player stories with the backstory, with the script, with the narrative, or the game story. They are not. That's that thing. Player stories are very much about what happens to the player in the game itself. The story and the script narrative of the game can be part of the player story at the same time. Okay, so just keep that in mind. It's an important distinction there. So I've got an example. Or do you have any questions? I'll pause there for any questions if you've got any questions, Fraser. Or comments.
It's sounding to me like a technique we used in wayfinding, which was I think it was called the walkthrough, which was essentially almost like a storyboard where you describe either with words or visually sort of the path a person will take and what they see and hear and feel along the way.
Yep.
Is that sort of on the money?
Not using storyboards, I wouldn't say. Although I guess you possibly could use storyboards. I hadn't really thought about that so much. I guess I was coming more, because my background's more sort of IT. So I was thinking more, in fact, about user stories that sort of come from the agile world of software development.
Right.
So, but the way you describe this can be either way. But it's sort of a high level description of what's going on.
Yep.
With the player. So I have an example here. So this is a example of a player story describing a typical wipe day in the game Rust. So what happens in Rust is that it is a multiplayer, massively multiplayer game. I guess you can have 100 or more players on one server. And what tends to happen is that the servers will have a life cycle, which might be a week, might be 2 weeks, could even be a month, but they tend to be sort of around the 1 to 2 week, 1 to 2 week life cycle. So a wipe day is the day basically as soon after they wipe the server and create a new game world. So everything starts kind of from scratch. Make sense?
Yep.
And it's usually the most exciting part of the game. I don't know whether you've played sort of multiplayer games like this, Fraser, but it's usually one of, like, everyone wants to get in on wipe day. It's where lots of opportunities there. Everyone's kind of starting from the same point, and it's a good time to actually get on there. If you're late, then of course you don't necessarily have the best choices to build a base. Other people have sort of progressed before you have, so there's limitations there. Now this is kind of long. I normally wouldn't read this out, but I think it's kind of important to actually get an idea of what we're talking about when we're talking about player stories. Now this has come from, we did look at this last week, I think. So was it this one? This is the overview of Rust. Yeah, we looked at this last week, but then we also have the player story. So this sort of comes from, this is the document that I had together. So this is the text from here, and it sort of goes into sort of a lot more detail. So you can see the amount of like text and diagrams we've got here. So there's a lot of sort of stuff that goes into this. I have kind of made it a bit more. I've tried to keep it down, simplified a little bit, so as not to make it too complicated or boring. Does that sound all right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's go.
So, all right. So I'm going to read through this. Okay. So this is the player story of a wipe day in Rust. So I wake up naked and alone on a beach, armed only with a rock and a torch. At this point, I'm completely vulnerable and pretty much anything can kill me. As it is wipe day, there are dozens of other fresh spawns logging into the server and racing to survive and find the best base location on the island. At this point, I have little in the way of gear and resources to lose, but competition for the best base locations will be fierce. Driven by a sense of fear, excitement, and the desire to win, I run at full speed to find a good base location and collect enough resources to build a small base. On my journey, I encounter a few other players. The unwritten rule in Rust is trust no one. If I'm lucky, I see them first and attack before they know I'm there. If I am unlucky, they see me first and I get headshot with a spear, lose the meager amount of loot I have been able to accumulate, and respawn on the beach to repeat the process again. Anxiety runs high. After a few false starts, stunning victories, and humiliating defeats, I finally have enough resources to build a base in the spot I've chosen. I've crafted a building plan, a hammer, and tool cupboard which will prevent another player from building near my base once it has been placed. I have managed to get enough wood and stone to build a small 1x1, a single room with a metal door and a key lock. It's not much, but it will keep me alive and give me a place to store resources so I don't lose everything if I'm killed and looted. I choose to build under cover of darkness. With any luck, I will get it done before being seen by another player. I pull out the building plan and start placing a foundation and walls, when all of a sudden, out of the darkness, smack, another player, alerted by the sound of my building, has headshot me with a bow. My panicked fingers mash the keyboard while my adrenaline-fueled right arm sends the mouse across the desk, spinning my character around a couple of times on the spot, giving my nemesis ample opportunity for a second shot. Smack, a body shot with this time, but it's enough to bring me down. Sweat drips down into my eye, blurring my vision as the message, "You have been injured. You will die if you don't get help soon," comes up on the screen, and my character lies prone in the game. Or my avatar lies prone in the game. All that time, all that effort, all those resources, my precious base gone, unless I can somehow save the situation. So I do what any brave, resourceful player would do in the same situation. I grovel. GG, buddy, good shot. I say using the in-game chat. I see the other player character looming over my body. Come on, man, can you pick me up? I've been killed hundreds of times today. I say in my most pathetic voice. He makes no reply except to start looting my body and taking all my precious stuff. He has played the game if he has played the game for any time at all, he knows how duplicitous Rust players can be. If he picks me up and leaves a weapon on my body, I'm just as likely to kill him with it as soon as I'm back on my feet. Having taken everything he wanted, he teabags me a couple of times and ends my tortured existence with a hatchet to the head. I wake up naked and alone on a beach. So that is a player story describing a high-level player experience.
I think the first thing that jumps to mind is actually back when I was doing script writing.
Yep.
Because, and it's funny, you talked about how this could essentially be the start point, which is how I feel like that sort of script writing went. Like, you come in with a vague idea, and writing the script helps you get there.
Mm-hmm.
And then, because I can almost see, going through and highlighting the different aspects, what parts are, actors in the game, what parts is player experience.
Mm-hmm.
And it helps. I love how much it helps realign focus to being on the player experience and the emotions and all of that comes from playing the game, and not just, the functional relationship. So.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it can't, I think this sort of thing. I guess if I make an observation, I think one of the challenges video games, digital games have, is that they came really from programming. If you think of the makers of from ID Software, was it James Abrash and oh goodness me, how can I forget the other guy? Remember the other guy, the programmer, James Abrash and
I can think of John Romero.
Was it John Romero? Is there another guy I'm trying to think of? Anyway, they're all coders. And Carmack, that's what I'm thinking of. Yeah. So he's still heavily involved in. He was working for Meta for a while. He's still quite involved in sort of 3D type stuff. Programmers don't tend, with some exceptions, don't tend to write this sort of stuff. This is not what programmers generally enjoy doing. This is the sort of thing that more big picture people tend to do. Programmers, by their nature, tend to be more focused and detail focused. Whereas to write this sort of stuff, you need to have a bigger picture. And I think this is one of the reasons why game design hasn't progressed in some ways, because you need to have the mind, I think, of a designer, of a sort of a big picture sort of design person to do this sort of stuff. Whereas I think a lot of game design in maybe the last 40 years or so has, because of historically, has been kind of dominated by the sort of more programming culture. And look, my undergrad is in computer science as well, so that's where I come from. But I also like stories and things as well. So I think that's one of the challenges we have in that. So sort of, designers and maybe more humanities people would find this fine. Programmers, I think, would often have some issues with starting at this particular point. So anyway, anything else you wanted to say, Fraser?
Yeah, I guess I can see where you're coming from in the sense that there are a lot of questions in here, and that is purely the nature of the difference between a narrative story like this and a game where there is interactivity and choice to be made. And so I could definitely understand, if you were to write this and then to try and hand it straight to a programmer, they'd be like, "What am I doing with this?"
Yeah, yeah,
Which is
absolutely.
why I think it's we the value of it comes from how it frames the player experience, their emotions, and all those things we've talked about,
Hmm.
sort of trying to capture, um, and sort of getting that heightened version of it. Trying to like wrap it all up into one neat little story, which I think
Hmm.
is done well here.
And it's interesting. I think psychologically, stories. I think it has been said that our mind is kind of like stories are some of the building blocks of our mind. Stories themselves are fundamental to human experience, which is quite interesting. So framing it as a story, really sort of brings it back to what's going on within our mind as
Mhm.
well.
Yeah,
So
I mean that
yeah.
was all over the wayfinding book that I was reading is about how uh, travel and navigation is encoded in similar ways as stories, and I think
Hmm.
that sort of lines up with that. The memory people that try to remember as much stuff as they can, where
Hmm.
they encode that into a physical space, but also tie a story to it. So yeah, I think narratives are really deep, deeply
Mm.
seated in the human brain for sure.
So you're pretty comfortable with narrative and writing stories then, Fraser?
I don't have a lot of like direct experience in writing,
Hmm.
but yeah, I've been sitting in that sort of narrative space for a long time for sure.
So if someone asked you, so you're designing this game at the moment, if someone asked you to start uh, writing player stories for your game, would you be comfortable doing that?
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Because it's not. I think it's important to keep in mind. This is not the same as as writing a screenplay or anything, which I wouldn't be comfortable writing a screenplay because I don't know anything about it. But I'd be comfortable writing this because
It
I know
actually
a lot about playing
reminds
games.
me. It reminds me of. I haven't done it. I haven't written it out as extensively, but this is a very similar space to where I've started for the D&D stuff that I've done.
Okay.
Um, is coming at it from sort of like the player story,
Mm-hmm.
and then building world elements, lore elements, enemy encounters to sort of fit and to help guide it. And I
Mm-hmm.
think in that sense, where I was saying there's a lot of questions left in here, that's the same for sort of tabletop role playing, right? It's like I like to go in with a story in mind, build all the things to support it, but then
Mm-hmm.
have the open space on the edges so that if the players take different turns, it still works.
Yeah. So I guess the difference between a tabletop role playing game like D&D is that and a digital game is that you can be more flexible as a human being with a mind. You can kind of be more flexible if things are not defined. Whereas in a digital game, everything has to be coded. Like you're not there, you know,
Yeah,
you or I are not there. If there's a game there and someone does something different, the game has to still stand. So we
and at
have to be
least
more detailed. I think.
yeah,
Yeah.
at least for me with the D&D prep, it's about creating things that can support me
Mhm.
in the playing session,
Mhm.
whereas obviously in games it's about creating things that support the player.
Mm. Mm. Yes. 100%. Cool. Okay. Should we carry on?
Yeah.
All right. So, as I said before, there is a hierarchy which we just looked at. So we have the wipe day um, player experience that we just read through. And within that, we have other player experiences. So definitely resource gathering. We've talked about resource gathering. We talked about crafting. We talked about base building. We talked about combat. So within that one experience, we have other experiences as well. And you could potentially go down into more detail here. Although I think perhaps at this point, so if we can look at some examples here, this is kind of where the game components involved in the player experience are described using game actors. So we've got the player experience. Um, and as an example, so let's have a look here. So these are some simpler ones. I'll show some little more complicated ones in a second. But we're talking about resource gathering. So this is the relationship diagram here. So basically, we're going to have one avatar there, And within the game world, we're going to have a lot of resources. So if you're giving this to your, and there's a relationship obviously between them. This is the relationship diagram. This is going to tell, like if you're giving this to your development team, you know, there's one avatar, there's going to be lots and lots of these. So it tells them something about that. And then we've also got the interaction diagram, which is the other part of that. We've got here, so a solid line is something interacting with something and then also communicates with. So, and you would include some text here to tell them what's going on. This is again the resource gathering experience, which says have our resource pickup. So the avatar interacts with the resource pickup here. And then the resource pickup in return will communicate with the avatar saying, hey, you just picked up like 100 wood or 100 stone or whatever it is. Now a coder or a technical team at this point should be able to say, oh yeah, okay, yeah, I know what's going on here. There's enough information here for me to create that pretty straightforwardly. Shouldn't be too difficult. Make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah? We have talked about these the last couple of weeks, haven't we?
Yes.
These sort of things. So some other examples, which we did look at, and I haven't, let's put it up there. So we looked at these, I think, last week as well, the photo actor. There's a couple others I've got here, but this is a fairly good example. We've got the photo puzzle experience. You've got the frame puzzle down here. And you can see this is the actor relationship diagram. The photo frame puzzle, there may be many of those within the game world. It's a single player game, so there's only one avatar. But each photo frame puzzle also has one photo frame and multiple photo pieces there. And also each photo frame puzzle is linked to one door and will unlock that door once you complete the puzzle. So you should be able to see again, you know, how this all works together. And then we've got descriptive text here, which you always do need to support this. And then in the interaction diagram, you've got the same thing: photo puzzle experience. We've got the photo frame puzzle, and what happens here is the interaction this time. So we've got interacting with and communicating with. The avatar interacts with the photo piece. So as an example, you know, when we were going around looking at Silent Hills PT, we're looking for these photo pieces. We zoomed in on them, and then the photo piece basically says, yeah, I've been interacted with, communicates to the photo frame puzzle, which then also updates the photo frame saying, hey, this photo piece has been found. So then it appears in the photo frame. Once it's been completed, the photo frame puzzle, all of the pieces have been found, then it communicates to the door and unlocks the door. So that's kind of what we said last time. That's kind of the lowest level of the sort of the whole system of describing how the games work.
Yeah, I think I like this one the most because it feels more intuitive to me.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I definitely I have to stop myself from thinking about how you can add more information to it. Like, you know, how do we indicate that the door only opens once all the photo pieces are there? But I'm like, it doesn't matter. That's not the point of this diagram.
Yeah.
This is to show that base level.
Yeah.
Which I think, yeah, you know, once that's understood, that's when you start building on and go, okay, well, here's the specific details. And it's also because, like, those specific details don't matter as much as the base sort of interaction, right? Like, whether it's 6 photo pieces or 3 it matters, but it's not as important as the photo pieces interact with the frame puzzle and the photo frame.
And I mean, you do bring up a good point, and I think we did talk about this previously as well, is that, you know, how much information do you need to provide? So if you're doing a specific thing, then yeah, you might say we're going to have maybe, you know, X to Y photo pieces. So maybe, you know, 2 to 10 or something like that. But the question is sort of, you know, where do you need to put that? How much information do you provide? Etc. So if you're just doing a generic photo puzzle experience here, then in a way, I guess putting an upper limit there may be a good idea. Having said that, and you can put it somewhere, but it is a question of how much information you should have, and where you pass it off to the IT, or so the technical team, and you just say, okay, that's enough information. Obviously, they can come back to you and ask questions if they need to, but there should be a point where you're like, okay, that's enough. That's the information that you need, and there may need to be more potentially. There's certainly opportunity for developing things more and more. The number of photo pieces, as you point out, could be a fairly important piece of information.
Yeah, and it also doesn't get into things like where they're placed, but I guess the more information you add, the more confusing it gets.
But why would you tell programmers where it needs to be put?
Yeah, well, no, not not in that scenario.
So it's not like programmers don't. That's not what they're worried about.
No, yeah,
just in the game world somewhere.
Please, yeah.
So a programmer needs to understand that it needs to be there in the game world. The designers or the level designers, once you get into that, but then you would come into here and we're in game world. You could certainly add that information. Obviously, this is a very small game world, but you could add that information in there if need be, or you can kind of also leave it up to them to, depending what you're doing, because if they're designing the specific parts of the game world, then it may actually be better to leave it up to the level designers to decide where it's going to go.
Yeah.
Again, there are definitely grey areas where you would probably need to negotiate with your development team how that's going to work.
Part of working in a team, I think, is having those grey areas.
Oh, absolutely. So that's pretty much the whole thing. We've kind of covered the whole gamut there. So we do have now, because let's go back to sort of where we were talking about it initially. So we do now have, a way we have tools for the designer to design the player experiences, describe the player experiences, and then translate those into different diagrams, different documents, using game actors, and being able to give those to the development team, who then will be able to develop the game. And with any luck, we have a player who will then be able to play the game and have a great player experience. So that's pretty much
Do you
it.
want